It was a long path from India here and Pepsi. And when you became CEO of Pepsi, I understand that your first thing you did, or one of the early things you did, was reach out to Steve Jobs for insight on how he ran Apple. And it's funny, Steve Jobs, Ed Woolard, share I have, is the one who brought Steve Jobs back to Apple. There's a funny connection between Weinberg Center and him. What lessons can you share that he shared with you that can you share with the audience? Because you two are very interesting business figures, or he was.
First of all, thank you for having me here, Charles. And for all of you, we left Greenwich, Connecticut at 4:30 this morning to drive down to Delaware, Newark, Delaware. I'd only do it for Charles Elson. To me, it was the most important thing that I could ever do. So, Charles, you have this unbelievable ability to get people to jump through hoops for you. But, you know, Steve Jobs was iconic, is iconic even today. And he took a consumer brand that was great, that had sort of gone into disrepair, and he brought it back. And we had brands that needed to be revived. And I couldn't think of a better person than Steve Jobs. I talked to many people around Apple, but I wanted to go to the source. And I never thought he'd give me the time because he was not known for being the warm and fuzzy kind. You know, if you call me, I'll give you time. But, you know, it was Steve Jobs. But funnily enough, when we reached him, he said, yeah, come on down. Let me sit down and talk to you. He gave me a couple of hours, which was also very refreshing. And he couldn't have been nicer. I mean, all the stuff I'd read about him being difficult to deal with, etc., was totally wrong, at least with me. He was kind, he was outgoing, he was welcoming, talked about a wide range of issues. What all did he tell me? You know, he was on a health craze at that time because he was not very well. And so he suggested that I get rid of anything that was fun for you and remake Pepsi as good for you. Now, that's not practical. So, you know, you take all his suggestions and then you process it in your head. Some of it you implement, some of it stay in your head. So that was one of them. The second thing he said was he'd already studied our brands, and he said, you got to give it a good makeover. And you've got to get design into the company. Design has got to report to you. Everybody's got to know that you love design. So I hired a designer, and you know, we have an unbelievable design capability, and he was right. The third thing he said was you've got to show you're passionate about certain things in the company, not everything. I mean, you can love the company, but a few disciplines that you feel very strongly about, show your emotion. And he wasn't being negative or destructive. All that he was saying is, if somebody took that particular passion of yours and didn't treat it well, throw a tantrum, show you care about it. To me, R&D, design, execution and the shelf were my passions. And so when things didn't go well, I did throw a temper tantrum my way. I mean, not the normal way of throwing a tantrum, but I do it in my own way. And so, you know, he taught me these lessons which stood him in good stead. So I had to adapt it for my style, and I must say it stood me in good stead too. And I wish there were more Steve Jobs around, to be honest.
Remarkable figure as of you. What things do you think are important in leadership, being a good leader? I mean, you ran an enormous organization. What qualities do you look for in a leader?
So, I mean, I've talked about the C's model, but let me sort of tweak it a little bit and talk about what it takes to be a good leader, especially in today's environment. I think any leader today has to be incredibly competent at something, has to have hip pocket skill that is just well known, and everybody looks up to that leader because they're so good at that one skill. And not only be good at the skill, have this incredible curiosity to keep furthering themselves and learning more. I've often heard that the distance between a number one and number two is constant. So if you want to lift the organization, the CEO has to lift, you know, him or herself up so that the whole organization comes up with them. So it's having competence, but having a curiosity to improve that competence level. The second I'd say is courage and confidence. Very often people are very good and know a lot of stuff, but they don't have the courage to speak about it or the confidence to speak about it. And if you don't, what's the point being competent? The third then, the sister skill with that is communication. It's an understated requirement, and I feel bad that some CEOs are not very good at communicating. You know, you refer to the 2-hour sales meeting. I needed those salespeople to be on my side. I needed the front line to accept that culture is going to change in the company. And I can't do it in sound bites in 30 minutes or 15 minutes because it's telling the story. So if I showed that I was tired or this was a speech as opposed to a passionate call to those people, I wouldn't have got them on my side. So I had to get myself up to communicate in a way that they understood, to take the time to unpack the whole story. And that's what I had to do at that time. So communication is something that's very important. And I'll tell you a little aside. When I was at the Yale School of Management, we had a requirement that to graduate from the first year and go to the second year, you had to pass an oral and written communications course. And if you didn't pass it, you couldn't go into the second year. In my life, I've never failed a course. The only course I failed was in oral communications because I spoke too fast and my brain and my mouth were not synced up. The two women who were there, Maria Holcomb and Jody Stein, worked with me to sync up my brain and my speaking so that I could communicate my ideas in a compelling, understandable way. So I'm eternally in gratitude to those two people. So communication is critically important. In today's world, as I've often said, the team around you determines whether you're successful or not. How you coach people is critically, critically important. The final one I'd say is your compass. You can be everything else, but if you don't have a moral compass that points to true north, everything falls apart. So integrity and having a compass is critically important.
Well, I think, for any business education, this notion of integrity really is the key word. And it's interesting, you don't hear it very often, very rarely, even in law schools, which you should hear it, you don't. And I've always thought that at least the governance course we teach at Delaware, that's really sort of the cornerstone around which the course is built. So if you don't have that a reputation so hard to gain, so easy to lose.
True, and in today's world with all the ESG goals and the fact that many companies are little republics themselves, citizenship is also something we need to add. It's very few people understand what it means, but we should add that in as a requirement for a leader.
Well, switching a little bit to governance, because this is a governance conference, I guess. What characteristics, skills, whatnot, do you think is important to chairing a board? You chaired a board. Chairing a board is very different than being a CEO. Two different roles. And there's debate over whether you're combining the roles or not. But what's important about how does one become an effective board chair? And now you're actually on two boards as an independent director. You may end up in that role at some point. What do you look for?
Are you wishing it on me? Or
oh, yeah, absolutely.
No. So,
I was there for the 2 hours. You were pretty good.
Sure. So, Charles, I tell you something. What would be a big service to all of us on boards is defining the role of an executive chair, a non-executive chair, and a lead director. I kind of sort of get an executive chair because it's also part of the running of the company. But as you think of a non-executive chair and a lead director, what are the differences in the roles? Because to me, I think they might be one and the same. If you have an executive chair and a strong lead director, it's like having a non-exec chairman. So I think it's very important we understand the roles of the lead director, non-exec chair versus the CEO, and where you don't need an exec chair if you have a non-exec chair. We had combined roles, but our lead directors were always very strong. We had Jim Shiro from Zurich, then we had Ian Cook from Colgate, and both were very strong, involved lead directors. They were called presiding directors, but they were really lead directors. And what was their role? They got involved in setting the agenda of the board well in advance of the board meeting. It wasn't just 2 weeks before the board meeting. Right after the first board meeting ended, they were involved the next week in setting the agendas. They would have several meetings in between board meetings with me to talk about how's the company doing, what are the issues, what are shareholders saying, what are customers saying. So they had their finger on the pulse without interfering in the day-to-day management of the company. And they ran the executive sessions very well without the CEO being present. Even though I was chair, executive sessions didn't have me at all. And they ran extensive executive sessions where all members of the board were free to talk. And the feedback I got was relevant and critical. It wasn't always, you did great. It was, these parts of the company were fine, but these are the 4 things that we think you ought to do better. If you're willing as a CEO to accept that kind of feedback from your lead director or non-exec chair as opposed to he doesn't like me or she doesn't like me. That's a natural tendency. If you go down that path, having the best lead director and non-exec chair doesn't help, because ultimately as a CEO you have to take the feedback and change. In our case, we had an excellent board, a very good lead director, and a history of very good lead directors. So having the chair CEO role combined was a non-issue for me, because our shareholders were very well served by our lead director structure.
How do you build an effective board? What are the effective ingredients for a really decent board, an effective board, not an advisory board, but a monitoring board?
So this actually goes to the strategy of the company, because at the end of the day, you've got to link structure, company organization structure, and the board structure to the strategy. We did something in PepsiCo which I would strongly encourage companies to do, and I'd strongly encourage investors to ask of companies. I think way back in 2008 or 9, right after the financial crisis, I wrote a very extensive document. I took 6 months to write it. I wrote down the 10 mega trends that are going to impact CPG and food and beverage companies. 10 mega trends. And studied it for a long time. And for each of the mega trends, I described the mega trend and I said, these are the implications of the mega trend. This is what it means for the company and the moves we have to make, the changes we have to make. This is what it means for the caliber of people we need to have, the capabilities, the caliber of the people, and this is what it means for the board. So we had this source document, which was 25 or 30 pages, made every board member read it, made the senior managers read it, but then I visited with each member of the board and said, let's go through this page by page, because we're going to have to make some changes based on the megatrends. We're going to have to recruit a board that can guide us through these megatrends. And if our board was not aligned to the megatrends and knew how to provide stewardship for the company, then what's the point of having the board? So when we looked at the matrix of capabilities, it was always mapped against the megatrend requirements of the company. Again, it's not cast in stone because something might change. We updated it every 3 years. Then we recruited board members for that. So I think it's important that if you think of good governance, don't stack your board, shape your board. Very important. Some people stack the board. Yeah. The board is not your friends and family. The board has to exist to provide a true fiduciary role. So shape your board for megatrends, don't stack your board for personal gains. Make sure you keep them informed, not after the fact, well before the fact. And make sure you have an ongoing dialogue with them. And be willing to renew the board when you find that board members have skills that are outdated and not needed for the board.
You very good, by the way, explanation of a board man. You should be a good governance committee chair. What do you think?
Oh, God, no. Before I leave today, I'll have so many jobs from Charles, I wouldn't know what to do.
But, one thing, in Pepsi is a very different company than it was when you got there. Pepsi was an icon. It stood for, the Pepsi generation. It was things that were fun, quote unquote. You changed the strategy dramatically. And frankly, the role of the CEO and the board is, in fact, long-term strategy. It's not where we are today, where we're going to be in 10 years. And you changed that strategy dramatically. Tell us a little bit about the change in the strategy, because I think that's what I heard at that 2-hour meeting. And you were an amazing communicator, because I wasn't working for the place, and I was excited about it. But tell us what you did and how you did it, because you turned an ocean liner around, basically.
Yeah. It started with the megatrends. We codified it in 2008, but the concept of the megatrend started when I became a CEO, because it was there bubbling when I was president, but then it really got codified in 2008, but simmering in 2006 and 2007 when I took over. And the writing was on the wall. To me, strategy is not a sort of a paper exercise. Strategy is something that, especially in a consumer company, you've got to feel the strategy, you've got to see the strategy, because it's consumer behavior and where the consumer is going that guides our strategy. So I'll give you a simple one. Way back in the late 90s, if you went to any PepsiCo meeting, on the credenza would be sitting beverages. People would be drinking the regular Pepsi, other beverages. But then by 2004 and 5, a lot more Diet Pepsi was being drunk and much less regular Pepsi. Then fast forward to 2006 and 7, Aquafina was on the shelf, and Aquafina was being depleted faster. Now, if that is not consumer shifts, what is? Why do we separate out our own consumer behavior from some other consumers? Because we are consumers too. So I'd always come back to our people and say, strategy in the consumer world is what we live and feel every day. So look around you, look at your family, your friends, look at all your ecosystems, and look and see what they're eating, drinking, how they're behaving, how their lifestyles are changing. All of that should inform our strategy. So when we rooted the strategy in exact changes happening in the world, everything changed. I would say to people, what if we started off by saying, every child in the world is my child? What would we feed them? And what would we feed them to eat or drink? And do we think our portfolio matches what we would feed them? So we had to improve many parts of the portfolio to offer a wide range of products. And even our fun for you products, we reduced the salt, fat, sugar content. So we feel very proud of the record we had. I would ask them, look, would you like to live next to a landfill, which is a mound of plastic? They said, absolutely not. Don't forget that today's landfill is your foundation tomorrow. Because, when landfill gets covered, that's where they build buildings. So that evokes people's consciousness. So they say we better work on plastic use reduction. Water usage, you just go to any country where there's water distress. They're struggling to get water for daily use. I grew up in such a city. We make a fun for you product in that city by taking water deeper and deeper from the bore wells in the aquifers. That's just not right. So when you frame the strategy in terms of day-to-day behavior of the consumer, who are our employees also, and our employees are fathers, mothers, aunts, uncles, brothers, sisters, they're citizens. You find out that you can actually communicate the changes that have to happen, but you get them to follow you. And that's how Performance with Purpose was born, which is deliver great numbers, but do it with the eye to society's consumption of products, how we want to deal with the environment, and how we want to deal with our people. And that's why the strategy change resonated with the people, and we could change the DNA of the company.
Did Pepsi change consumer preferences, or did consumer preferences change Pepsi?
Both.
Both.
Both. I think that it started with the consumer preferences changing. But we were in a neighborhood where we started to change, I think going back to 97 when we bought Tropicana and then Quaker Oats, we were starting to change. But we were in a neighborhood where a competitor was saying, Pepsi is all wet behind the ears. The consumer is not changing. Pepsi is trying to change the consumer. Wrong. I think PepsiCo was going where the consumer was going, and that was the right direction. So the first few years, I took a lot of flack for it. But then subsequently, people said, man, why didn't we think about this before? So.
Well, you were correct. In fact, well, look, this leads us to the next question. There's a debate. In fact, we did a program here at Delaware about a year ago on short-termism versus long-termism. And there's big debate. What is correct? You've led PepsiCo for 12 years. What's your view of the whole? Is it a real debate? Is it not? Are most businesses long-termers? Is there really a difference between short-term and long-term? And how does it play out corporately?
Yeah. It sort of befuddles me that we're having this discussion. Because if I look at big companies, you want us to be around for the long term. I mean, if you're a pension plan investing in companies, you want to have this anchor group of a few hundred companies who generate a good dividend so your pensioners can get that dividend stream, and then there's good capital appreciation. Why do we look for a short-term bump in capital appreciation and then go for a bust and expect that from that busted scenario would rise a phoenix from the ashes? Somehow to me that feels like incentive structures are not properly aligned for the company or for the fund manager. Instead, we have to worry about level of returns and duration of returns. Because I think getting 15% earnings growth for 3 years and then bust for the next 3 and then coming back to 15 is not the right way to run the company. You've got to have a very good balance of the level of returns and the duration of returns, because then you're reinvesting in the company and you're making sure it's a going enterprise. How do you do that? I think the best way to do it for traditional companies is to look at the revenue growth and the profit growth and the link between the two. If a company is operating in an industry which is a 2% growth industry and the company is generating 3% growth, if that company generates profit growth of more than 7 or 8%, ask the question, are they reinvesting? Just because they generate only 7 to 8, don't say, oh my God, they're too bloated. They should generate 15 because some competitors generated 15. That's a 1 or 2 year point generation because they're not reinvesting in the top line growth or they are hollowing out the company. To me, that deep discussion is not happening enough when people look at companies. On tech side, it's much more difficult because they're investing so much in the top line. That's a whole different way to look at tech. But I think the large preponderance of traditional companies, it's very important for investors to look at the link between the top line and the bottom line and look carefully at, are you making the R&D investments? Are you investing in the right level of automation? Are you investing in the right level of training, improving your people? Are you investing in the right sustainability goals? So downstream, you're not hit with a huge complaint from the consumer. So I think it's very important we change the dialogue and debate to those deep strategy questions as opposed to sound bites on television on, so-and-so generated 15% earnings growth while XYZ company did only 8. My God, 3% earnings growth and 8% profit growth. Go buy that stock today.
You are on the cover of Directors and Boards magazine on corporate culture. Great issue, by the way. I'd get it. If we have the editor here, she can pass out some of the. Tell me about corporate culture. How important to an organization is corporate culture, and how do you deal with corporate culture as a CEO and now as a director? How do you view culture from those two perspectives?
Difficult, because in many ways, the CEO of the company sets the culture of the company. A company might have great character, may have a great culture, but a CEO can come in and change it, because in most companies, we are a sort of a rank and file organization where the CEO issues the marching orders, and if the board agrees with the CEO, the organization has to comply and execute. And so I think it's very important that the CEO selection is important, because the selection of the CEO determines what the character of the company is going to be and how the culture of the company is going to evolve over the next few years. That's something we looked at in our succession process, in the history of our company. We not just look at the capability of the CEO, we look at the character of the CEO and what do they feel, what do they care about, what are the issues that really make a difference to them. And so I think too often, a company might have a great run. You get a leader whose character, whose key driver is short-termism. Clearly, that's going to cause the company to sort of zig when it should be zagging. So it's very important that we all think of ourselves as going concerns and evolve the culture of the company into one which renews itself, invests in itself, because as a country, that's what we need. I always talk about this, Charles. When I was CFO, I remember I was talking to an investor from Hong Kong, a sovereign wealth fund based in Hong Kong. And they asked me questions like, tell me about your people development. How do you do talent search? How do you train your people? How do you do succession planning? Tell me how you think about R&D bets. Same kind of questions that the GIC in Singapore asked me. And they never asked me a single question about the quarter. Not a single question. And I was, I think, there in GIC for over 2 hours. And same thing in Hong Kong. These are the kinds of questions. They wanted to know how I was running this company to keep it going for a long time. But it was a jarring juxtaposition, because when I came back to a conference here and had a series of sell-siders sit with me, the first question was, so what's the quarter looking like? Okay? It's important, but I'm not going to tell them what the quarter is going to look like. Okay? Don't throw a shot in the dark asking me what the quarter is going to look like. Ask me those questions they asked me back in Singapore. And I don't think enough people ask those questions. Some very good people ask the questions, but not enough people ask those fundamental questions on how are you running this company to make sure it's around for the long term.
You are now an independent director, Amazon Schlumberger. So now you are on the other side of the governance divide. Very important. I can remember Ken West, who had been head of Harris Bank Chicago, became lead director at Motorola, he suddenly said, my life changed dramatically. I now look at things quite differently. Ed Brennan, who'd been head of Sears, became an independent director of American Airlines and McDonald's and several other companies. All right, now you're on the different part of the divide on the governance biz. What are your views of governance as an independent director now, and some of the changes that have taken place? You've seen it from the CEO side. Now you're a director. What's going to happen this year? What should be happening?
No, I think the role of the director is a sort of a squirrely one, because you are the fiduciary, yet you've got a CEO that's actually running the company, and you've got to make sure the CEO is responsible for running the company. You've got to have your finger on the pulse, but not meddle in the company. So it's always this delicate balance between how much should you get involved and not get involved. There's always a debate and discussion on what should you see the shareholders for and not. Should you talk about the operating parameters of the company, or should you just talk about governance issues of the company? And when it comes to strategy, just hear from the shareholders what they don't like. Don't opine on the strategy. Let the CEO talk about the strategy. Should the board member just listen to the shareholders and come back and feed that into the company? I think one thing we're all trying to figure out is, what's the role of the director versus management? Do they work together when it comes to shareholders and governance people, or should board members go see them independently? I honestly believe that on strategy issues they should see each other together, unless there's a difference of opinion, in which case the board member should listen to it separately. You talked about me now being on the other side of the divide. Even when I was at PepsiCo, I owned a lot of PepsiCo stock. I mean, I think 50 times my salary or something. My net worth was all PepsiCo. And I kept it that way all my life. My financial advisor would come to me and say, you're out of your mind. You've got to diversify. I said, I am diversified. I'm in PepsiCo, 4 different businesses. Thank you. But the reason I say this is because when you're so vested in the company, you're not just the CEO. You're also an internal activist. You're also on the other side of governance, because you want this company to do well, because how that company does, how this company does, determines my children's trust fund, determines what I can give to charity, determines my own future as I retire. So I was on both sides of the divide, and as I go to Schlumberger and Amazon, I have that equal sense of responsibility. I mean, Amazon is going to take me a while to learn the company. It's a spectacularly huge company. Schlumberger have been around for a while now. So I feel like I'm on both sides of the divide.
Activism.
Uh-huh.
What's
that?
Yeah, we've heard of that. You got a lot of shareholders in the audience. In 2013, obviously, Trian, Nelson Peltz bought a stake in Pepsi and launched a campaign to split the company. You had to deal with it for 3 years. How did you deal with the challenge, and what lessons can you take from it? What recommendations would you make to a CEO, board, facing the same sort of thing?
Yeah.
As I remember when you went through it, and you navigated it incredibly successfully to everyone's benefit in the end. How'd you do it?
So first, we had 2 activists. That's what people don't realize.
Oh, I remember the other one
We
too.
have 2. We had the first one we had was relational investors, Ralph Whitworth.
That's right.
And a year after that, we had Nelson Peltz. Let me get to the end, and then I'll come back and give you a little bit on the story. Ralph Whitworth left our stock about 18 months after he got into the stock. Ralph and I remained best friends until he passed away. And every time he came to New York, he and I had dinner. And it was a wonderful relationship, and I'm glad Ralph Whitworth entered my life as a friend. In the case of Nelson Peltz, I've known him forever. He came into my stock. Every time he got on TV and said something, he'd call me and say, Indra, I didn't say anything about you, right? I said, Nelson, you can say whatever you want. I'm an internal activist, you're an external activist. My life, my net worth is tied up in I will not do one thing that destroys the future of this company. But if you have a good idea for us to improve the performance of the company while investing for the long term, I'm happy to hear it. My board is happy to hear it. But if you have an idea of how to make a short-term buck which will impact the long-term future of the company, I will not do it. If my board wants to do it, they have to get a new CEO. And my board said, we love our CEO, we love our strategy, we aren't changing one thing. Nelson made a lot of money and he left, okay? We made no accommodation. Now, Bill Johnson came on our board. Bill Johnson's still on the board. Bill Johnson's a fantastic board member. And Bill Johnson is very careful to say, I'm an independent board member. I may have been part of Trian Advisory Group, but I'm a CPG CEO. And he gave me an article that he wrote, or he was part of the interview, I think way back in 2006, where a reporter asked him about what he's long on and what he's short on. And what he's long on, he said Indra Nooyi as CEO. So he gave me that article to say he believed in PepsiCo then, he still believed in us. But we made no concessions for Nelson Peltz except one thing. We listened to him with great respect. We took every one of his suggestions, analyzed them thoroughly. We did not poo-poo any suggestion that he gave us. Every criticism he gave us, we took it personally. We realized all the fallacies of the accounting system, which needs a lot of work based on the analysis that activists do of companies. We also realized that when you have people who haven't run companies on the activist side, telling companies how to run companies, we have a problem. We have a problem, and it's got to be addressed. But at the end of the day, the biggest learning was activists are people too. And if you treat them with respect, and if you listen to them carefully, and you view yourself as an internal activist, both sides end up in a better place than where we started. Until today, Nelson and I remain very good friends. I like him.
Well, Mr. Johnson came to a Weinberg conference about 15 years ago, when we first got started, and it was right after the Peltz investment in Heinz. And he talked about, very similarly, about reacting, and it was interesting, his philosophy and approach was very similar to yours, and it worked out very well for him.
But I didn't go through any proxy fight, nothing. Zero.
That was unpleasant.
Zero.
But he ultimately, when they did come, it worked out. And your approach was, I think, much smarter in the end. A similar result, or not a placement on the board, but the listening and engaging and ultimately resulting in a successful result of the whole thing.
It's interesting, even through the activist fight, a little story that I'll tell you. We never had an activist in PepsiCo because we've always viewed ourselves as managing the company very responsibly for the long term, with a reasonable focus on the short term. When Ralph Whitworth and Relational first came into the stock, every banker that would call on us would ask us to hire all these governance lawyers, all these additional bankers to help us do the analysis, and then would opine and tell us, oh my God, this guy's bad news, he's really going to give you a tough time. And so when the first time Ralph Whitworth came to see us, they said, don't meet him in your offices. Let's meet in the office of the law firm. I said, okay, fine, I'll meet wherever he wants to meet in New York. We met in this law firm, which required you to go up 2 buildings and get to the law firm. I said, you know what, the guy's going to be lost. Let me go to the elevator and greet him. They said, don't do it. Don't show that you're giving up control to him. You shouldn't. You should sit in your conference room and wait for him to come to you. I looked at them and I said, forget it. I'm going to go to the elevator and greet him. So I went across 2 buildings to the elevator, greeted him, and said, are you Ralph Whitworth? He said, yeah, he'd come with his entourage. We walked to the conference room, and within the first 10 minutes, everybody was surprised because we were friends. All of a sudden, 10 minutes, we both clicked. And he actually said to me at the end of the first meeting, oh my God, why am I in this talk? Your strategy is just right. Keep doing what you're doing. The point is, we didn't try to behave like prima donnas who knew everything and other people didn't know anything. Right off the bat, we treated each other with respect based on our own belief in people as opposed to advisors telling us to act a certain way. And that led to a very positive relationship with the activists.
He was a very unusual person. I mean, Ralph was on our advisory board for years and was a
I
good
remember.
friend, and I was on a couple of boards because of Ralph as a quote
Very
dissident.
good human being.
He was a terrific investor and a particularly nice person, and very active very early on in the governance area. I mean, he got his start not as an activist, but in the governance
Hey,
space.
Nelson, I'm calling you Nelson, Charles. Don't be fooled by Nelson too. He's actually a very nice guy.
Oh,
he just comes across. He has to play a part to act like this tough, all this activist. But deep down inside, he's a softie. So he's a really good guy.
His son-in-law was sitting in your chair last year at our conference.
Yeah.
It was, but you know, it's an interesting
He's
space.
different.
Very,
Nelson's a-
very different. So let me ask you this before we've got just a little time left. What are the big issues in governance that you see this coming year? We're going to be having a panel talking all about it. What do you think are the seminal problems, issues that we've got to think about this year going forward?
I think it's very important companies think about this whole issue of stacking versus shaping boards. What is the caliber of the board? If the board is really a fiduciary, the shareholders' representation on the board, on the company, do we have right people on boards? Are they giving enough time to the company? And is the company giving them enough material in a timely way? I think we should look at that very carefully. And as companies get more complex, is the board time on the company increasing? Because really, if the normal board meeting is 1.5 days, but the company has now gotten to 3 more lines of business, and the board meetings are still 1.5 days, what were they doing before? And what are they not doing now? You should ask all these questions. I think we look at output metrics. What we don't look at is sort of tailpipe. We look at tailpipe, we don't look at in-process metrics. Are you having the right board meetings? Are the agendas properly structured? Is the lead director truly knowledgeable about how to run the dynamics? Do they have the capability to command the rest of the board members? Is the board being shaped for the trends that are coming and hitting the company going into the future? The one thing that always amuses me, when we write the risk section in the K's and the Q's, who really reads that risk section?
That's a good point.
And how often do you really question a company on the risk section?
Yeah.
Okay, because that to me, companies do a fine job writing up the risks. But do people really talk about scenarios around the risk? And I think boards should have the enterprise risk discussion in a much more detailed way, and investors should pay attention too, because after the fact, we're very good at trying to analyze what went wrong and then put in place a punitive regulatory framework in place. But I think in anticipation of what could go wrong, because it's all there in the statements, I think we ought to think about what kinds of things we ought to be putting in place.
Wrapping it up. You've had an amazing run, an incredible career. You've got a lot of students sitting out there. One day, someone will be one of those who they say CEO material on the. What advice would you give them? You've had an amazing career. What would you say to someone starting out?
Yeah, two things. I'd say to them, two different sets of things. While you embark on your career, don't forget that even as you leave the University of Delaware, you have to remain a lifelong student. The world today is changing so rapidly, driven by technology. If you think studying stopped when you left the university, you're mistaken. I'm still a student, and I feel like there's not enough hours in the day to read and learn stuff. So you have to be a lifelong student, and that's almost necessary today. Second, put your hand up for the most difficult assignments. Nobody cares about you just keeping a good thing going. Put your hand up for the most difficult assignment. Show that you can deliver on a tough assignment, and all of a sudden you'd be viewed positively for promotions. The third is, don't go out saying, I want to be CEO. It doesn't work. Until the day somebody told me I was going to be CEO, I wasn't running for CEO. I was just happy doing what I was doing well. If you do the job that you're doing very well, you will be CEO one day. So just make sure you do that. And the fourth lesson I'd say to you before I give you a final comment is, along the way, you'll come across a lot of mentors and supporters. Treat them very carefully. If they give you advice and you don't take it, go back and tell them why you didn't take their advice. Because mentors don't like it when they give you advice and you constantly ignore them. Because why should they give you advice? Because you're not going to listen to them anyway, except to say, oh, so-and-so is my mentor, but don't listen to this person. Doesn't work. Go back and tell them, look, you gave me this advice. Let me tell you how I modified that advice a bit and I implemented it, or let me tell you why I didn't implement it. It's for these reasons. Okay? The final point I'll make to all of us, we all live in this world of capitalism. Some people would say capitalism gone amok. Some will say capitalism has been a force for good. I honestly believe capitalism is a phenomenal thing, has done so much good for the world. But I'm also reminded of, the Devil's Dictionary, for those who haven't seen it. Ambrose Bierce wrote something called the Devil's Dictionary. He said something very interesting. He said, a corporation is an ingenious device for obtaining individual profitability without individual responsibility. An ingenious device for obtaining individual profitability without individual responsibility. Never forget that being part of a corporation, running a corporation, has enormous responsibility. We get carried away by the financial benefits from it, but we forget the responsibility. And the responsibility lies in running the company for the long term, running it with a view to society, not forgetting that most corporations are little republics, and we actually owe a duty of care to every society in which we operate.
I want to thank, I told you she was good.
Charles, thank you. Thank you, Charles. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you.